Hi there, I'm Tess. I'm a visiting professor of political science at Amherst College, and I'm here to talk to you today about the racialized political economy of personal bankruptcy in the United States. The January 6th insurrection at the Capitol highlighted the persistent presence of white supremacy in America. Commentators have drawn attention to the symbols of white supremacy on display: the Confederate flags, the Proud Boys flashing the OK symbol, the alt-righters with their Kekistan flags from 4chan, while others have pointed to the difference in treatment by law enforcement of the predominantly white pro-Trump mob, as compared to Black Lives Matter activists who were met with the full force of the National Guard in front of the Lincoln Memorial during protests following the murder of George Floyd during the summer of 2020. The past year has also drawn attention to the way white supremacy is embedded, not just in law enforcement, but in the broader structures of American society. Which brings me to the topic I'm going to talk to you about today: how the institution of personal bankruptcy, rarely studied by political scientists, is not only a large and underappreciated piece of America's welfare state, but one that is deeply racialized. Understanding how structures like personal bankruptcy are racialized can help us explain an enduring puzzle in American politics: why the racial wealth gap continues to grow in spite of reforms in housing and other credit markets that are intended to help non-white families accumulate wealth. Despite legislation like the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the racial wealth gap has not only persisted, but has grown for Black Americans, going from an 8-fold difference in 1983 to a 10-fold difference in 2016. I provide an explanation for the growth of the racial wealth gap, which is that both governments and markets are complicit in creating and upholding embedded white supremacy in the United States. In a welfare state that's characterized by its mix of government and market actors, the construction of white supremacy leads to a dual state that is simultaneously welfare providing for some while being predatory for others. The work I'm presenting today is a brief overview that's part of my book project, Constructing White Supremacy: The Racialized Political Economy of Personal Bankruptcy in America. So before I jump into the history of bankruptcy, I better tell you a little bit about how it works. People can file bankruptcy under Chapter 7 or Chapter 13, which are named after chapters of the Bankruptcy Code in which each procedure is described. In recent years, Chapter 7 bankruptcies have accounted for around 60% of bankruptcy filings. Since the passage of the most recent bankruptcy reform in 2005, anyone with above median income is barred from filing Chapter 7, except under very specific conditions. Thus, filers generally make less than median income. A Chapter 7 bankruptcy can completely discharge most kinds of unsecured debt, meaning that creditors can no longer make attempts to collect on it. Dischargeable debt includes credit card debt, medical debt, and personal loans, such as payday loans. It does not include student loans, tax debt, criminal debt. The entire process takes about 4 to 6 months from filing the bankruptcy petition to discharge. But because bankruptcy is a civil procedure, filers are not guaranteed any legal representation. And hiring an attorney for a typical Chapter 7 bankruptcy costs around $1,500. Bankruptcy stays on a filer's credit report for 10 years. Under Chapter 13, this is a slightly different procedure. So this is for folks who make above median income, or for people with any income level who want to stop a foreclosure or a car repossession, and that's not possible through Chapter 7. Unlike secured debt, like a mortgage, unsecured debt in Chapter 7 goes away, but secured debt, like a mortgage or a vehicle loan, is not discharged through bankruptcy. If the filer wants to keep their house or their car, they have to repay any missed payments and then stay current on their loan. These repayments are made over a 3 or 5 year plan, which all filers must make monthly payments of all their available income. The payments go first towards repaying any secured debt, mortgages, vehicle loans, and then any additional amount goes towards unsecured creditors, the credit card debt, the medical loans, in proportion to the size of their claim. Because most people who file Chapter 13 generally have a large amount of secured debt from their mortgage, it has to be repaid. So the amount that goes towards things like credit card debt, medical debt, and personal loans is usually quite small. They mostly get discharged, like in Chapter 7. And like in Chapter 7, student loans, tax debt are not dischargeable, though some criminal debt can be discharged through Chapter 13. Importantly, in Chapter 13, the discharge only occurs if the 3 to 5 years of repayments are completed. And this only happens in less than 40% of the cases. So 60% of filers actually end up back where they started, with creditors able to make collections, but also out around $3,500 in attorney's fees. And that's regardless of whether the bankruptcy is completed or dismissed. And again, regardless of whether you complete it or it's dismissed, it stays on your credit report for an additional 7 years. And interestingly, regardless of which chapter people file under, you can only obtain a discharge in a particular chapter once every 8 years. And so this means that people actually sometimes cycle between chapters. So in my ethnographic research, I talked to people going through Chapter 13 bankruptcy. But because of the cycling feature, a lot of people I talked to had previously filed under Chapter 7. In recent years, there have been around 800,000 bankruptcy filings per year in the United States. To give you a sense of the magnitude of that number, this is very close to the average number of divorce filings per year in recent times. As shown on the graph, bankruptcy filings peaked at around 1.75 million a year in 2005, before the Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act, colloquially known as BAPCPA, went into effect. And this forced most middle-class families to file under the more arduous Chapter 13. Despite this restriction in bankruptcy filings, bankruptcy actually rose again to more than 1.5 million a year in 2010 as part of the fallout from the Great Recession. Bankruptcy scholars expect that a similar boom will follow the COVID-19 recession, though as with the Great Recession, it will likely take a few years for this boom to materialize, because people tend to put off filing for bankruptcy until they absolutely have to. Examining the size of the economic transfer orchestrated through personal bankruptcy allows us to see that even during times of economic expansion, personal bankruptcy constitutes a larger economic transfer than other more visible welfare state programs, such as the Supplemental Nutrition Action Program, colloquially known as STAMP or food stamps, which is shown here in red, or the Temporary Aid for Needy Families, colloquially known as cash welfare, which is shown here in green. Moreover, we can see that personal bankruptcy, the blue line on that graph, is actually much more sensitive to broader economic conditions. You can see that personal bankruptcy filings actually peaked in 2010 following the Great Recession. When they peaked, more than $400 billion was transferred from creditors to debtors through bankruptcy. Thus, we can see that in terms of the size of economic transfer, bankruptcy actually exceeds other more visible welfare state programs. In my ethnographic interviews with Americans going through Chapter 13 bankruptcy, bankruptcy's role as a form of social insurance was really prominent. I found that filers understood their bankruptcies as stemming predominantly from family, health, housing, livelihood, and cost of living issues, and usually included events from 3 or more of these categories. And I've put up just a few quotes from folks who I talked to who were going through bankruptcy about what had precipitated their bankruptcy. And you can see that a lot of it is about housing, some of it is about mental health, some of it is about job loss. And importantly, although I, as a social scientist, conceptualize personal bankruptcy as part of America's welfare state, my participants generally did not see it in this light. This is an interaction I had early on in my research when I asked a research participant whose pseudonym in my work is Bob, whether he saw his experiences in his financial position as related to economic inequality or the distribution of wealth. His response was pretty enlightening, and it gave me a good hint that although I might see personal bankruptcy and the conditions that surround it as really political and as related to distributional politics in America, my respondents were much less likely to take this perspective. In fact, seeing issues related to credit as personal rather than political is pretty widespread. In a survey of consumers, political scientist Mallory Sorrell found that respondents predominantly blame consumers, bankers, and lenders for predatory lending rather than political actors such as Congress, the president, or federal agencies. And this really highlights that Bob's perspective here is not unique. It's not an anomaly. So turning to the political development of personal bankruptcy, its role in the construction of white supremacy becomes particularly clear. Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the power to pass uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcy throughout the United States. Despite this mandate, which has been there since literally the first article of the Constitution, during the 19th century, bankruptcy laws were present only sparingly because they were introduced in response to economic crises, and then were generally repealed shortly thereafter due to significant disagreement about what form bankruptcy should take. Prior to the Bankruptcy Act of 1841, for example, filers were limited to certain elites, such as merchants. Homestead exemptions which prevent creditors from touching housing assets up to a certain value, first appeared in independent Texas in 1839. And then they spread to southern states, and eventually to pretty much every single state in the US except for Pennsylvania and New Jersey. These exemptions were first used to try to attract white settlers to displace Mexicans and Native Americans from land in independent Texas. And although it would seem to violate the mandate of the constitutional mandate of uniform bankruptcy laws, there's still variations in homestead exemptions that exist across the United States. And on the whole, these exemptions advantage homeowners, who are still far more likely to be white, with the 30 percentage point gap between Black and white home ownership rates currently at its highest level in 50 years. But returning to the 19th century, the Bankruptcy Act of 1841, which responded to the Panic of 1837, was the first to apply broadly to all white male debtors. Though when it crossed paths with the system of enslavement, it turned the courts into slave auctioning firms, making the federal government actively engaged in the selling of enslaved people. And this is illustrated by this notice printed in the Asheville News in 1859, which reads that 2 enslaved people will be sold for cash at the courthouse door because of a decree of the Court of Equity. Following the Civil War, personal bankruptcy was again used as an economic recovery plan. Historian Lee Thompson writes about how the Bankruptcy Act of 1867 was imposed on the South by a radical Republican Congress, which, rather than redistributing planters' lands to free people, as had been promised by General Sherman's famous 40 acres and a mule dictum, or rather than responding to women who were clamoring for political rights, actually implemented what was described at the time as a non-political and purely economic Bankruptcy Act, that of course was actually anything but that, and instead reinstated the racial, economic, and gender hierarchy that had been present in the South prior to the war. This history really is elucidated by the numerous moments in which we see agreements among whites to uphold and construct white supremacy. And we realize that bankruptcy is one place where this type of development occurs, in a place that we might not even think to look. So rather than a relic of a bygone era, the construction of white supremacy through bankruptcy has really remained a feature of it as an institution. In 2019, I had the chance to spend 3 days observing Chapter 13 bankruptcy proceedings in Memphis, Tennessee. Rather than in a courthouse or another public building, bankruptcy proceedings in Memphis are held on the ground floor of this large black office building, pictured here on the left. Over the course of my 3 days of observation, I had the chance to see firsthand how bankruptcy proceedings are different when the majority of the filers are Black. Compared to all my other research sites, Memphis was notable for how little time was spent on each case, with debtors conducting their intake meetings standing up instead of sitting down. And it was actually the only location I studied which had a full-time representative from criminal court present at all the bankruptcy proceedings. During my second day of observation, I sat myself next to this representative, and I was able to see on their sheet what the different criminal charges the people's debt was coming from. A significant number of the people who I saw that day had fines that were due to driving without a valid license. This holds a fine of $500 in Tennessee, or 6 months of jail. And given that Black motorists are disproportionately likely to be pulled over for driving while Black, these bankruptcies can actually be seen as part of a broader racialized system of predatory governance, in which bankruptcy adds an additional insult to injury of an already deeply unequal system. As I dug into the dynamics of what I'd observed, I learned that in certain municipalities, which also happen to be some of America's majority Black cities, so Memphis and Chicago, local government has chosen to use Chapter 13 bankruptcy as a repayment system for people whose driver's licenses have been taken away and who cannot pay the entire fine up front. So instead of providing a state-run repayment system, these municipalities force a group of disproportionately Black Americans to file for bankruptcy in order to get their licenses back, adding stigma and employment-damaging marks to their credit reports, and also making it so that this is the only way to get your car back so you can drive to work. Unfortunately, bankruptcy's contemporary racial features don't really end there. Legal scholar Michelle Dickerson, who's examined who benefits under the contemporary bankruptcy code, and she finds that in pretty much every aspect she looks at, the ideal debtor, who is the most likely to economically benefit through filing bankruptcy, is more likely to be white. Legal scholars have also noticed that Black debtors are more likely to file under the less forgiving and more difficult Chapter 13 process, and the odds of receiving that discharge, which we know are already really low, right? Less than 40% of people make it through already. But those odds are 40% lower again for Black and Latinx filers, even after controlling for education, income, and employment. Some scholars find that these higher rates of Chapter 13 bankruptcy filings stem in part from pressures from attorneys who believe that Black filers should exhibit more personal responsibility. And so they push them towards Chapter 13. And others think that it's because these attorneys have set up a system that allows them to collect money up front from filing Chapter 13s. And because of the system, people end up paying about $2,000 more on average to have their cases dismissed at a rate that's 18 times higher than if they'd had the money to pay upfront and file a Chapter 7. Another unexpected feature of personal bankruptcy that you might have remembered from the introduction I was telling you a little bit about how it worked is that student loans are not dischargeable. Prior to the 2005 bankruptcy reform, private student loans were dischargeable in bankruptcy. But as part of that reform, lenders were able to get all student loans excluded. And that really highlights some of the consequences of when welfare is hidden, who has a lot of power in that space, namely private actors who have a large financial interest. And of course, this particularly affects Black students, who have higher rates of student loan debt than their white peers. And the student loan gap, which we know is large at the time of being in college, actually triples within a few years of graduation. In addition to being related to student loan debt, or the lack of being able to discharge student loan debt, personal bankruptcy is also related to predatory inclusion in mortgage markets. In the build-up to the subprime mortgage crisis, Black and Latinx borrowers with good credit scores received subprime loans at 3 times the rate of comparable white borrowers. And families can stop a home from foreclosure by filing Chapter 13 bankruptcy. But as I highlighted before, it doesn't change the terms of your loan. You still have to repay all that debt. And what it means for these families is that they get locked in to predatory loans. As legal scholar Abby Atkinson explains, this means that for communities that are already vulnerable to mortgage discrimination, the lack of a bankruptcy modification option really compounds the risks of economic disenfranchisement related to home ownership. Thus, we really see bankruptcy as part of a government-supported predatory inclusion of non-white groups in credit markets. And this reinforces critical race theorist Cedric Robinson's observation that racial inequalities persist and are maintained because they're a source of capitalist profit. So in addition to thinking in this institutional and developmental structure, I also interview people and try to understand their stories to understand bankruptcy from the perspective of those who are living through it. My ethnographic interviews with families going through bankruptcy really allow me to speak to how bankruptcy as a racialized social structure is reflected in the ways that everyday people understand their bankruptcies and the context in which they occur. In my interviews, I gather information about how my research participants had come to file bankruptcy, and then through longer follow-up interviews, I collect information on their life histories, their political perspectives, and I try to put this in the context of their economic lives. A prominent theme in the political perspectives I collected was that people have very racialized narratives surrounding hard work and deservingness. On this slide, I show the perspectives of Greg from North Central Utah and Kenny from Eastern Tennessee. Greg and Kenny are both middle-aged white men who both work as skilled laborers, Greg as a mechanic and Kenny as an elevator repairman and sometimes contractor. Both were conservative populists and supporters of Donald Trump, though neither identified as a mainstream Republican. And as you can see from these quotes that I hope you've had a chance to look at, in our interviews, both of them really drew on racialized narratives of entitlement, making it clear that they felt minorities were the entitled. So while we really might expect to find these positions amongst middle-aged white male Trump supporters in red states, what surprised me was how ubiquitous such racialized narratives were. Here I show the perspectives of 2 middle-aged women in Massachusetts. Amy manages a jewelry store in what she describes as a dying mall. And Jennifer works as an administrative assistant in a public school. Amy identifies as white, though she also has some Canadian Indian heritage, and Jennifer identifies as Black. Despite their different political views, Amy is a conservative, Jennifer is a liberal, both repeated a similar racialized refrain about hard work and deservingness. And I came to understand these narratives as part of a deep story in the style of sociologist Arlie Hochschild. This deep story about hard work and entitlement is really widely drawn upon by Americans in explaining their politics in the context of deep personal economic insecurity. These broadly accepted racialized narratives lead to a phenomena that I call the Archie-Edith dynamic. For those of you who are not familiar with the 1970s sitcom All in the Family, it follows the life of the anti-PC, proto-Donald Trump Archie Bunker and his family, including his wife Edith, who is often pushed into accepting Archie's point of view, even when she might disagree with it. The result is a sometimes tacit and sometimes explicit agreements to uphold a logic of white supremacy. And I found this in some of my interviews, as illustrated by this statement from Patty from North Central Utah. Patty starts out by saying that if she saw someone struggling, she would want the system, the state, the government to help them. But then she inserts, and agrees, with her husband's opinion about the entitlement of certain immigrant populations. Patty's statements are an illustration of agreements among whites to uphold white supremacy. And they illustrate how the personal dynamics of bankruptcy actually are part of this racialized social structure that is reflected in the political perspectives of everyday Americans. So, what should this all teach us about what we might do to change bankruptcy? My ideas about bankruptcy reform were really shaped by an interaction with one of my participants, who we met on the last slide, Jennifer. When I asked Jennifer how she might imagine achieving the American dream, her response was really telling. She said she wanted Andrew Yang to become president, and she wanted him to be able to implement a system of universal basic income. And when I started this research on bankruptcy, I thought the goal would be to try to propose reforms to personal bankruptcy to make it better. But instead, I realized that I'm sure some reforms would certainly be salutary, but a better solution would be to seek a new social contract in which debt and personal bankruptcy are not a key part of a social safety net that's actually invisible to most people, including those using it. Scholars have emphasized that for many members of disadvantaged communities who rely on fringe economic services, reforming away even seemingly negative institutions, things like payday loans, may leave people with actually fewer options for survival. And reforming bankruptcy on its own may also have similar unintended consequences. So, for example, making it possible to discharge student loans in bankruptcy is supported by President Biden, but it could have negative consequences if it's not done carefully, because discharging student debt could lead private lenders to increase interest rates on student loans, which would disproportionately affect Black students. And that would be something where, in compensating for their bankruptcies, the people who would end up paying for that would be often minority students. So my ideal policy would be to tax profit in the financial sector and use it to fund universal basic income and reparations. And then you wouldn't really need the same legal system we have of consumer bankruptcy. I would create it with I would replace it with a state-run system of debt relief. So in addition to really building on Jennifer's observations about universal basic income, I draw on Cedric Robinson's observation about the need to address embedded racism. And that's why I think that you need both UBI and reparations. I'm also drawing on the work of political theorist Ronnie Hirsch, who really pushes political theory to grapple with the question of what profit should be. And for her, she draws on Adam Smith's idea that profit should not be inherently unlimited, but actually a rather uniform, boring rate that can act as a productive constraint on potentially predatory business activity. So to bring us back to where we started this talk, thinking about the racial wealth gap, what I hope that you have come away with is that the explanations for these trends did not emerge overnight, and that they've come through a long history, and that deconstructing them will take a large effort, because a lot of these things that are upholding and constructing white supremacy are hidden in places we might not expect, like personal bankruptcy. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to discussing this topic with you and engaging with your questions about this soon.